So again, thank you, Margaret, wherever Margaret went to. The behind-the-scenes person. So welcome to this morning session, which is the first of 3 sessions that we'll do in regard to this topic that I called these teachings the joy of letting go, breaking free of harmful habits. So we're going to start with a short meditation where we begin this exploration, as I've done in the last evening sessions that I've done, kind of conduct a meditation that allows us to focus the mind a bit, and then on the basis of that begin this investigation. And I'll prompt you to have some things to think about that we'll use in the teaching and begin to explore this topic. So just find a good meditation posture, something that works for you, that's comfortable, and yet having this kind of uprightness, alertness to the body. So make sure that the back is straight, the head kind of upright as well, tilted forward slightly if you wish, tucking the chin in just a bit, and this will bring the gaze downward. It's good if you can have the eyelids slightly open, but certainly you're welcome to close the eyes. And then just check the rest of your posture, making sure that you're relaxed in this posture. There's no tension in the body that might become an obstacle for meditating. And we're going to begin with just a few minutes of watching the breath. As I always say, if you have a technique that you already use to focus on the breath, you can use that. Again, some people focus on just the general sensation of the breath. Some people might use a point at the lower abdomen, the rising and falling. Some people even in the center of the chest, paying attention to the rising and falling of the chest there. But what I encourage people to use, I find it just a useful point, is the point at the tip of the nose, where we feel the sensation of the air coming in and out of the nostrils. And for some of you, it might even be closer to the upper lip and that area underneath the nose. But there's a sensation that occurs as you breathe in and as you breathe out. So if you're using this technique, just simply tune into that sensation and make that your meditation object. Just staying present with it as best as you can, but then checking in occasionally and seeing whether you're still together with that object. And if you find that you've separated from it, that suddenly you're thinking about things that are on your mind, maybe you've gotten distracted by sounds, whatever it is that has pulled you away from the breath, just acknowledge it, let go of it, and return back to the breath. So we will be talking about meditation practice as part of this weekend as well, and the importance of developing these skills of concentration and mindfulness, introspection. But for now, just again, engage in this practice as best as you can, keeping your awareness with the breath. When the mind wanders, bring the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl to begin that period of silent meditation, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection. So now with our minds a bit more focused, let's begin this investigation of this weekend's topic by looking at a question that essentially is, where in your life do you feel that you're stuck? In other words, what are the sorts of habits that you have that you feel are keeping you from moving forward, keeping you from being in touch with deeper qualities, feeling more contentment yourself, being more at ease with others? And you might think of physical or verbal habits, but I want you to maybe go beneath that, to really look at the mind states that are underneath those. So do a little investigation to just see what are the sort of mental patterns that you feel create some sort of stuckness, create some obstacle for you in terms of your well-being and the well-being of those around you. You don't have to come up with a whole list, just really one to clearly define that you can look at over the course of this weekend. I'll give you just a minute or two to reflect upon that and see if you can delineate very clearly what sort of mental patterns or habits that you have that create that difficulty for you. And then generate a motivation for being here to explore this topic. Initially with just that simple intention of wanting to begin to address that habit, that mental pattern that keeps you in that stuck state, keeps you from progressing, keeps you from having deeper well-being. And then moreover, to generate the awareness that inevitably others are affected by that as well. So we can think about the others that we interact with, that we have met with, that are in our lives, that we will meet, and think that we're also here with some concern for their well-being. That if we weren't so stuck in that particular habit, we might be of greater benefit to them. So next, kind of bring that motivation outside of yourself to that circle of people who you do have contact with. And then try to enlarge that motivation to even go beyond that. To think that the way that we are in the world and our freedom from these harmful habits will also have a greater impact on the well-being of all beings, potentially by helping us to develop into a being that can benefit others quite directly, into a Buddha, a fully awakened being. Each of us having that potential to fully awaken, and kind of setting our sights on that goal, whatever that means to you right now, to be able to fully develop all of your qualities, to remove completely all of your negative tendencies, so that you can then help others most genuinely, most effectively. So again, thank you all for coming here today. What we're going to do is, again, this idea of sort of letting go of these habits that we have. And we'll go back to what we reflected on in the meditation shortly. I was kind of struck by, I had a visit with Venerable Angie. Some of you know Venerable Angie Muir, who's down at Rinpoche's house in Aptos. And she told me that Geshe Cherub was asked once if there's a mantra that will help you to let things go. And Geshe Cherub's answer was, yes, Om let it go soha. So you can all leave with that. Work done. Om let it go soha. There they go. All your harmful habits just disappearing. I think we need more than a mantra. He was obviously kidding. But I think that this is, again, so much of our Buddhist work is to really look at kind of the thoughts and the states of mind, the things that in particular we're quite familiar with, what we call these sort of familiar scripts that we go through in our minds, they become our habits, and that they have been deeply ingrained within us. And of course, this goes down to a very deep level. We're going to get into that eventually as we go through the weekend. It's kind of the underlying thoughts that are a part of our fundamental ignorance that are influencing the whole process. But we're going to start at a very much more superficial level, in a sense, where the rubber meets the road, kind of. The Buddha himself in the Dhammapada, we don't use the Dhammapada quite as much in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but this is a collection of sayings of the Buddha that's in the Pali Canon. And he says, all experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. So this quote from the Buddha is really speaking once more to the centrality of mind in our practice. That's why I encouraged you in the meditation to go to, you might say, well, I have a habit of interrupting people, or I have a habit of criticizing people, or whatever the case might be. But that verbal extension that becomes our words when we're talking to others is driven by our minds. Everything is led by our minds. The thoughts that we have, the way that we frame things and look at things, those scripts that we buy into and that we get quite used to, how we look at the world, manifests in terms of our behavior. So our actions, physical actions, verbal actions, are not separate from the mind, but are led by the mind. I don't think we've ever had the experience where our mind is saying something and our thoughts are totally disconnected from it, right? The mouth is following the mind, the hands are following the mind, everything is following the mind. And so we have to pay attention to the mind. In almost any teaching where I talk about the mind, I have to go back to that definition of the mind just to make sure that anybody in the room, who doesn't necessarily know what the definition of mind is, has that to work with. I was going to maybe do introductions, but I don't know, maybe before we get started, to go too far, it might be useful just to know Buddhist background, because then I'll know how much of this I might need to share or don't need to share. Maybe we can start with our esteemed center director here. Just again, if you could say your name, and again, just some indication of your background in Buddhism, and it doesn't have to be, all the books that you've read and all the meditation retreats you went to or anything, just a summary. Great.
Hi, I'm Margaret. I think all of you know me, or most of you do. I've been in the Buddha Dharma.
Excuse me, Margaret. I've got very old ears. I can hardly hear.
Well, Lynn knows me.
Precious voice.
Well, I've been a student of the Buddha Dharma for a number of years. No, actually, I'm a wannabe student of the Buddha Dharma for many years. Genuinely, as more time progresses, I'm more of a wannabe than a student. So that's me. I try my best. That's all.
How many years would you say your number of years are?
I have to caveat this that I think number of years doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah, I started meditating in '97, but it doesn't mean anything really.
Oh wow, good. I didn't know that about you, though. Okay. Please.
I'm Joe. I've been, studying for just over a year now, and mostly through taking courses when I was in India and at Kopan and things like that. And just got back to the Bay Area.
Good. Thanks, Joe.
I'm Joanne. I've dabbled for, on and off for many years, but just a little bit.
Okay, good. Thanks, John. Would you like to go?
Okay. My name's Jake, and my interest started in Buddhism, I would say, about a year and a half ago. And so far it's really changed my life. So it's something I always try to come back to.
Good. Good to see you again, Jake. Yeah.
My name is, I'm Lynn, and part of the fun of thinking about how long you've been thinking about Buddhism, if not practicing it, is kind of trying to figure out when that began. And for me, it began a long, long time ago. But it was Dawn giving me, as a going-away present from Levi Strauss in 1993, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and then going to Nepal in that, it was the same year,
Same here, yeah.
and landing in front of Robina Corton. And so I've had...
Or her landing in front of you.
Yeah. And so from 1993 on, I've been on it and very involved with the FPMT in the Bay Area. And I'm delighted that OCB has gotten so dynamic and exciting. And I thank my roommate at Vajrapani, Margaret, for helping make that happen. And yours too. So thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah, my name is Urs, and I've been coming to the center maybe 10 years or so. I didn't keep track. So it just happens one year after the next, and so I'm just helping out at the center, and so that's my background.
Good. Thank you, Urs.
Hi, my name is Angela. I've been studying Buddhism for about 3 years, and similar to Joe, I took courses in Kopan and Tushita when we were traveling.
Good. Thanks, Angela.
And I'm Christine. I've been into Buddhism since right after my father passed away, and I was looking for a way to help him on the other side. And the first book I read is the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying,
Oh my gosh.
and that's how I am here today.
Okay, good. Thanks, Christine.
My name is Steve. I've been around various flavors of the Dharma since I think I was born. Was very interested in the Vedic tradition for a number of years, in Hinduism and so on, and found my way to Buddhism maybe within the last 10 years? It's hard to know. Discovered that I had on my bookshelf a bunch of books that referenced some guy named Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and went to a teaching with some guy named Dogre Rinpoche up at the Milarepa Center, one of our centers in Vermont. So it was quite a fortuitous path. I'm currently the SPC, or Spiritual Program Coordinator, at Vajrapani, Ursa's counterpart over at Vajrapani Institute, and that's me.
Good.
My name is Ashu, and I guess I've always been around some form of meditation and Buddhism all my life, but never really engaged. This year, in January actually, I took a compassion cultivation course,
Okay.
which awoke me to meditation and how a practice can really be life-changing. So I just started my journey, and I intend to continue lifelong.
Okay. Where did you take that course, Asha?
It was in Stanford.
Okay. Wonderful.
Who was your teacher?
Robert?
Robert Guzman.
Yeah.
Very
Good. I've heard good things about
He's
that
awesome.
course. Yeah. Good. Welcome. Yeah.
My name is Anne, and I've been working on my practice since about 2000. Originally started out with Vietnamese Zen, connected with Thich Nhat Hanh,
Right.
and then later migrated over to Tibetan Buddhism. So,
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Anne. To the back.
Oh, I'm in the back. I'm Sally, and I started taking classwork here in this group, with this group in 2001, after His Holiness taught at the Shoreline for a week. And that was kind of my entry into the study, and so I've been involved ever since.
Thank you, Sally. And finally.
I'm Nathan. I guess I've been practicing for a little under a year now. I have a daily practice, been to a retreat, hundreds of hours of Dharma talks.
Good. Thanks, Nathan. Good. So maybe with who's in the room, I don't need to go into quite as much detail, but I think it is important that we nonetheless define what we mean by mind. Who knows the Buddhist definition of mind? I always ask this because I like to quiz people a little bit. There's no written quiz at the end, but Sally.
Clear and knowing.
Okay, so it's that which is clear and knowing. So clear is referring to, again, that sort of luminous quality of the mind, that it's not material. It's not, substantial in the way that we talk about the body. We don't mean that there's an absolute division between what is mind and what is body, but rather that there is this continuity of phenomenon that we call mind, and there is this continuity of phenomenon that we call body. And those two have an interrelationship rather than being equivalent in any way. Mind does depend upon the body to a large degree in this human form that we have. We need our brains functioning and our senses all alert to the information we're bringing in. But the mind is not the brain. The mind is not the body, but rather is dependent upon it within this form. When this form ceases to sustain mind, mind continues on. And the implication of this is that mind was there prior to this body. And our minds have a continuity going back without any beginning and go forward without any end. So mind, when the Buddha says this, going back to that quote, all experience is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Mind is the creator of our experiences, and mind is the experiencer of those things. Mind has the function, in this definition, of knowing, of kind of being aware of things. And we can be aware of things in ways that are truthful, and ways that are in line with how things actually exist, and we can be aware of things in distorted ways. And the Buddha essentially says that we've been dealing with a lot of distortion in our minds, that our minds have not actually been in line with reality, sometimes even at just a conventional level, much less at an ultimate level, and we'll go into this in more detail throughout this weekend. But essentially what we mean by something that we would call a negative state of mind versus a positive state of mind is what type of result it leads to. So when we talk about this course title was, Breaking Free of Harmful Habits. Well, what makes a harmful habit is a negative state of mind that will lead to suffering. It creates difficulties for us. It creates problems for us. Now, we talked last night about how those problems can be a useful thing to use on our path. But nonetheless, the Buddhist path is still one that says that ideally we should want to be free of all suffering, all things that are disturbing to our peace of mind. And we should want to cultivate everything which is beneficial, everything which leads to happiness. Not happiness simply at a more temporal level, but happiness at the deepest level that we can experience, which is something we haven't even tasted in our lives. So, a positive state of mind is one that leads to happiness. A negative state of mind is one that leads to suffering. And this is, again, a fundamental truth that the Buddha taught that is kind of caught up within the concept of karma. That essentially everything that is a movement of our minds, everything that moves our mind in a particular direction, creates a result that is in accord with that direction, that is lined up with that direction. So it's not all kind of crisscrossed. We don't have positive states of mind and then experience suffering from it. We don't have negative states of mind and then experience happiness from it, but rather that it's very clearly delineated. So if we wanted to boil down the Buddhist path, I talk frequently about how we could say that essentially we are trying to do two things, which is to remove everything which is negative, counteract everything which is detrimental to our well-being, and then increase what is positive, increase what actually leads to happiness. We could say that that's essentially what we mean by a spiritual path, by a Buddhist path. But it's interesting, there is a way of setting this out that is called the Four Great Efforts, that is just simply an extension of this idea, because two of them relate to what is negative and two of them relate to what is positive. Let me read these four. I was going to put them on the board, but I think it's okay just to read them. So the Buddhist path, we could say, is one of engaging in the four great efforts. First, to prevent from arising negative states that have not arisen. The second, to let go of negative states once they have arisen. So these are all both involving the techniques how we work with the negative states. Is we want to be as vigilant as possible to make sure that negative states that haven't arisen don't arise. That's part of our work, is to kind of keep the mind from having those triggers and the whole processes, all the processes involved that flourish, that the negative states of mind will then kind of become more prominent in the mind. Moreover, when we do have those that arise, we want to be able to let them go, to kind of counteract them. And that's a good part of what we're going to look at this weekend, is what do we actually do at that time that will disallow that negative state to continue, and we can begin to become more effective in addressing it when it does arise, and moreover we can eventually get to the first one, which is to keep it from arising at all. Yeah. And of course these are complemented by the other two great efforts, which are very similar with regard to positive states of mind, to give rise to positive states that have not yet arisen, and to sustain positive states once they have arisen. So this is a good part of our work as well, is that we have to try to cultivate those qualities that we don't yet possess in terms of, the deeper qualities of compassion and loving kindness and patience and serenity and everything that we're trying to, and of course wisdom at the deepest level that is going to be useful for us. And any of those that have arisen, that we have seen arise in our minds, we want to sustain them. We want to try to maintain those. And it's not like we do these totally isolated from each other, these tasks involving the negative states and these tasks involving the positive states, but rather that we see that they are definitely going to be affected one by the other. The extent to which we can create and sustain positive states of mind is going to help us to curtail and eliminate the negative states of mind, right? Because this is a very simple equation at some level. We can compare the negative and positive states to like light and darkness. Can darkness exist when light is there? No. Can light exist when darkness is there? No. So the two are going to be opposing one another. And so what we are trying to look at in this weekend is what do we do over here to begin to address these negative states of mind, but moreover, how do we replace them with positive states? Because the positive states are a way of assuring that the negative states don't arise. If we're holding a positive thought, we can't possibly have a negative thought arising at that time. Maybe later, maybe moments later sometimes, And that's the work again, because we have to sustain those positive states of mind. We have to keep vigilant to make sure that the, delusions, negative states, all of that doesn't arise. So I like this way of presenting it because it kind of gets at the two subtasks that are within these. To address them when they've arisen, to either kind of keep them from getting stronger and diminish them, or if they're negative, or to actually strengthen them if they're positive. And then if we don't have them, to keep the negative states from coming in at all, and to make those that are positive come forth, kind of coax them out of our minds. So this is what our real task is, and this is what we're really looking at. I want to share a little story that I think a lot of people may have heard this. I don't know. I heard it shortly after 9/11. It comes from the Cherokee tradition, this Cherokee parable that's called the parable of the two wolves. Has anyone heard this about the two wolves? So an old Cherokee chief was teaching his grandson about life, and he said, "A fight is going on inside me. It is a terrible fight, and it is between two wolves." And the grandson's all interested in this fight about the two wolves, right? And so the grandfather continues, and he says, "One wolf is evil. He is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, self-doubt, and ego." And there's probably more to the list than that, but anyway, this is what that wolf is. And he goes, "The other wolf is good. He is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith." This same fight, the grandfather said, is going on inside you and inside every other person too. And the grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, "Well, which wolf will win?" And the old chief simply replied, "The one you feed." So again, this is a nice way of looking at our minds in essence, is that this process of addressing these two states is like two wolves fighting. Which one's going to win? Well, it's a very simple equation. The one that you feed, the one that you give the most energy and force to. So this is what we're going to be looking at this weekend, is how do we try to diminish our strengthening of the negative wolf, the wolf that is going to bring about our ruin and is going to impact the well-being of others around us as well, because once we follow that mind, we are greedier and more jealous and all the other things, and we end up upsetting a lot of people in the process. And how do we really feed and nurture the wolf that will actually bring about much greater well-being? So I like this parable because it really speaks to, comes from the Cherokee tradition, but speaks to what our Buddhist work is really all about. One other thing I want to share before we get into the main kind of investigation of this topic is something I shared up in San Francisco, and this was actually part of the course that we did down at Vajrapani that Venerable Tenzin Chokyi and I did. And I hadn't really come into contact with this before, and I don't think there's any problem with sharing this outside of that course because I think it's really useful stuff. There was a book by a woman named Barbara Fredrickson, who's a psychologist researcher out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, at the university there. And she introduced this theory that she came up with that is essentially about positivity. The book is called Positivity. And it's called the Broaden and Build theory. And what it is essentially saying is that these two states of mind that we're talking about, these two wolves, the positivity and the negativity, they can be seen in terms of what we would call like this spiral, that as it spirals down becomes narrower and narrower, but as it spirals up becomes broader and broader. And the idea behind this is that it's not a directly linear thing when it comes to the positive, nor is it even directly linear when it comes to the negative. As we cultivate and develop these negative states of mind, our minds get tighter and tighter and tighter. We have a narrower focus to our minds, and we find less options in terms of how we can act in other ways that are opposed to that. We don't have the broader base of skills to rely upon because we get very deep into our individual habits, our individual patterns. The negative states of mind actually constrict your thought process. They don't give you, again, that repertoire that you can pull from that will allow you to make different decisions. Whereas, when we go into the broadening positive states of mind, we find that as we cultivate and develop all these states that were mentioned in that story, right? Benevolence and kindness and joy, peace, hope, loving, love, empathy, all of these, they increase the repertoire that we have to draw from. They broaden the mind. And I think we know this from our own experience, if you think about it. Think about the times when your minds have been really, really tightly bound up in all of that kind of negative thinking. And then contrast that with what your mind felt like when you were much more at ease, when you were much more joyful, more loving, more kind. Think about events you've had with people that have been like that, where you just feel a natural spaciousness to the mind. And you know that then when things come into your sphere of experience and you're in that state of mind, you have a much greater wealth of things to draw from in terms of how you will respond to that and not react in our habitual ways. So this broaden and build theory is the idea that it broadens the mind, positivity, gives us kind of a greater dimension to work from, but it also builds in that it increases. It's that outward spiral that keeps getting larger and larger. Of course, in Buddhism, when we talk about the mind and we talk about its potential, we say that the biggest spiral that we can get to is, of course, the spiral of Buddhahood, where we kind of go even beyond the limits of our individual minds right now to embrace the well-being of all sentient beings. And this is, of course, our goal and our practice is to eventually achieve that state. But I really like this theory, and I like introducing it because I think it gives us another visual to kind of work with. And even to apply that visual to our states of mind can sometimes be quite helpful. You know, we have that phrase, right, that you're kind of the mind spiraling down, right? So if you think about that, that's what's going on when these negative states are arising. It's quite useful then to recognize it and to say, no, I need to kind of get it back up into more positive thinking. This is a bit of what we looked at last night in this idea of learning to like problems, is that if we can see a problem or difficulty in our lives and frame it in a way that it actually becomes a part of our practice, well then none of that negative thinking is going to go on because we're actually looking at it and saying, wow, this is a really amazing opportunity. This is a really helpful thing in my life right now. So this is the context for what we're going to be looking at in terms of this weekend, is how we actually create that force of the positive states of mind, that positivity. And it's interesting, in her book she goes into like 10 different things that she says are really contributory states of mind that help with positivity. Maybe I'll touch on those a little bit later. But that's a complement, again, to what we're doing in trying to diminish the tendencies we have that are negative, to stop going to those negative places, the tightening of the mind and what have you. It's a bit of what we talked about on Wednesday as well, in terms of making the mind spacious. As she says in this theory, when the mind is in that more positive state, it does feel more spacious. But I would say also, even just our awareness of the spaciousness of the mind can help us to be in a more positive state. They kind of work hand in hand, mutually influencing each other. Whereas the negative states make the mind tighter, but also our own tightening of the minds and narrowing of our focus makes the negative states more likely to arise. So these are, again, just some context for how we're going to be looking at this. So what I'd like you to do is just an interesting little exercise, because this is just one that I actually learned this at Levi Strauss at one little day event that we had in menswear. I was working in menswear finance, and we had this little day at the up at the marina or something. So everybody stand up. I'll stand up with you and do this little exercise to see if I can do this with the microphone. But actually, I don't need to stand up probably. But so what I'd like you to do is kind of just naturally put your hands out like this. And bring your hands together so that your two hands clasp. Just whatever way you do that, okay? So everybody look at how you have your hands clasped. Do you see that there's another way to clasp your hands? Right? So can you see that? So why did your hands go together this way? Habit. Okay? So now, unclasp them and put them back. Now bring them together in that different way. See how weird it feels, right? It's an interesting little exercise that kind of shows that the only reason why we did that is because of the force of our habit, but that we can do something different, right? Anyway, you can sit down now. Nice chance for you to get up and circulate the blood or whatever. So again, a very simple exercise, but points to the fact that we can change, points to the fact that the only reason why we do some things in our lives, and this might be the time, again, we'll do a little bit of sharing from the investigation that we did. The only reason why we have these habits is because we just keep strengthening them. We keep doing the same thing over and over again. And of course, how we clasp our hands isn't a huge thing, right? It's not like we have huge divisions in nations because you have the right into left claspers and the left into right claspers or something. It's not like there was that wonderful Dr. Seuss book about the Sneetches, I think it was, about the star-belly Sneetches and the... Anyway, I don't need to go there. But the point is that we are taking this kind of tendency, this habit, and we've made these things so deeply ingrained in how we are that it's sometimes hard to think that we could do things differently. It's sometimes hard for us to think that I could be more patient in the face of whatever's going on, or change my mind in ways that I'd like to. And the reality is that it's totally possible to change. It just is uncomfortable sometimes to begin that process. What I do like about other things in terms of, I mentioned this the other night, I don't remember where, if that was in San Francisco or here, but is this whole concept of neuroplasticity, which is quite interesting. In science, they're finding that there is this interrelationship between the brain and the mind, or consciousness. And of course, some scientists still hold that the brain is the source of all of that consciousness, but the idea being that those can have mutual effects, that it's not just our brain determining what the mind does, but the mind having an effect upon the brain, and the brain actually changing, and that we can continue to change the brain throughout our lives by changing our thoughts. So it means our thoughts are totally not completely independent of the brain, but certainly have their own way of being managed that is independent in that regard. We can change our thoughts greatly, regardless of what our gray matter is conditioned to do. So everything that we're talking about as a habit is simply something that we've conditioned ourselves to have as part of our mental makeup. And we continue to follow that simply because we haven't done the work to diminish it, get rid of it, replace it with something that is more positive. So this is just, again, some of the fundamental stuff that we're looking at. Any questions on any of that before we go on to take a look at how we're going to structure the weekend and the things that I want to... I mentioned to Jake before starting that I taught this previously, and I don't remember if I taught it as 2 or 3 sessions, but I had a slightly different structure to it. But I'm going to still cover everything that I covered then, and maybe even a few more things. But I thought it'd be really useful to structure this in terms of one of the points that's in the 7-point mind training. Last night I was talking about mind training. Mind training, or Lojong, is a whole set of teachings that come from the Mahayana tradition, specifically Tibetan Buddhism, that really help us to change our minds in very powerful ways. And one of the main texts of mind training, this all comes out about 1,000 years ago. Lama Atisha had come to Tibet, and he brought this tradition into Tibet, and then he disseminated it to his heart disciple Domtompa, and Domtompa then disseminated it to his disciples, and it became this whole lineage of what's known as the Kadam lineage, the Kadam teachers, who all practiced this form of mind training, and they often did it in secret. It wasn't something that was shared publicly until Geshe Chikawa began to share it in a much more public way. He's the composer of the 7-point mind training. If you haven't studied the 7-point mind training, it's a wonderful book. There's actually one of the free books on the shelf is The Kindness of Others. It's a commentary by Geshe Jampa Tekchok on this text. But one of the slogans in there is kind of the structure that I want to use for exploring this topic this weekend. And it's the slogan that essentially says, train in the 3 difficulties. So we got a warning right there that we're not talking about the 3 easies. We got 3 difficulties that we're training in that we're going to be looking at. And I'm going to put these up on the board. I may give you the language that Pema Chodron uses in her book on these, but I'll give you the way that they're taught in this tradition. So hold on while I put these on the board. Maybe I need something darker than that.
Would you like a thicker one?
I'm sorry?
Would you like a thicker one?
Might work if it's a little bit thicker. Might be better for the camera too, I'm thinking. So, hello, camera.
Don, this is such a Levi Strauss moment. You're standing at a flip chart. Oh my goodness, only it doesn't flip. We've moved ahead since
We've
the
moved ahead.
80s.
Yeah. And if I had really worked on it, I would have had a PowerPoint presentation for all of this too. So I do that sometimes, but I just didn't do that for this course. I apologize. So that's great. Thank you, Margaret. So let's put these 3 difficulties up here. Oh. That one's not working. Okay, we'll try number 2. Let's try purple.
Ice cream.
This may be a real Levi Strauss moment. There we go. Okay, so number 1 is to identify. Oops, missed an I in there. I'll just put it there. Identify the negative states. Number 2 is essentially to counteract them. And number 3 is to, I'll use the word eliminate. This means to completely get rid of them, eliminate them, through our continual practice. So these 3 difficulties of identifying the negative states, this is what we're going to start with this morning, and probably continue even a little bit into the afternoon. Secondly, to counteract them is to begin to look at what are the states of mind that we want to induce that will help us to keep them from gaining that power, kind of what I was saying earlier in terms of these 4 efforts. Keep the negative states that have arisen from strengthening or diminish the potential for them to arise at all. And then third, eventually eliminate them, meaning that we're not going to just kind of suppress them at that moment. We're going to look at the deeper things that we want to investigate in terms of what the Buddha taught, that the Buddha says are ways of completely eliminating them, so that we don't have to experience these negative states at all. We'll kind of be abiding in that state of complete positivity. Okay, so this is where I'm going to structure the weekend around this. We'll see how this works. This is a little bit of an experiment. But I really like this slogan, because this slogan of the mind training says again that this is not an easy task, that this is something that we actually have to acknowledge. The very first one, where we are going to start, is part of the process, and we have to put our attention there first. Why? Because if we don't learn to identify the negative states of mind when they're arising, we're not going to have much luck in doing the other two tasks, right? Sometimes we don't even, I think Buddhism defines a whole lot more things as negative than what our traditional culture does. I mean, if you go to a Western psychologist and want to work with them on maybe having better mental health and so on, you can see that they can provide a lot of tools and a lot of therapy that can be quite useful. But if you went into a psychologist and you said, I'd like you to work with me to completely eliminate my anger, to completely eliminate my jealousy, my pride, everything that you find is holding you back, they'd probably say, well, I don't have the tools for that. I can help you have a better control over those so that they're not out of control. And they might even say that having some level of anger or jealousy is an okay thing. Just not having the out of control one that wants to kill somebody on the basis of these emotions. Okay. So, there is some usefulness in not killing other people. This is definitely, good to go to the therapist so you don't kill people or don't have, those things running rampant in your life. But the Buddha's going deeper. And so, again, there might be a broader way that the Buddha's looking at negative states and the ability for us to identify them, counteract them, and eliminate them than what we see in Western psychology. So let's look at a couple of things in regard to this topic. The first thing that I want to, and this is another little mini structure that I'm going to go into underneath this first point, is what are called the 6 factors for the arising of our disturbing states of mind or our negative states of mind. Maybe before we go into that, because it might be useful if we could work with one or two of these. I know everyone's got their own little thing that you meditated on at the beginning today, right? Whatever you've thought was where you're stuck, what it is that you'd maybe like to address by being here this weekend, something that you might find useful. I'm not going to ask everybody to share that because I think that's really personal for you in terms of your own life. But if there's somebody in the room who would like to share something that they're working on, I'm happy to hear that. It might be useful to be able to go through these steps in regard to that. Not that that's all we're going to look at, because I'm going to give you a lot of information to work with these. But it might be useful, particularly in regard to some of these, to have that as an example. Is anyone comfortable sharing anything? Oh, well, we have Anne or Lynn, or what's your name?
Millie.
Millie. Well, should we do all three and then we choose which one? No, just kidding.
Sure.
Millie, would you like to share?
Laziness.
Laziness, okay. Okay, good. Laziness is a big one. All right,
Huge.
Good. Huge. All right. Anne.
Yeah, well, I call it self-protection, but
Okay.
it's been based on fear.
Okay, so there's some fear that's underneath that, yeah. With maybe, some vulnerability that is a part of that, perhaps. Yeah, okay. Yeah, all right.
Okay. I would say the ones that have been coming up for me lately are temper and fear of intimacy.
Okay.
So there's
Good.
and I think it's kind of similar to what you said. It's basically just the fears
Uh-huh.
and those delusions
Okay.
are the ones that I'm trying to kind of work with.
Okay, good. Thanks, Jake. Lynn.
And mine's sort of, it doesn't have a broad, I'll appreciate any input to make this label broader, but it's more like giving unsolicited advice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Good. And do you see the mental state that's underneath
That's
that?
what I'm saying. I didn't go.
Oh, you didn't go to
I was
that.
just
I'm
looking
sorry.
at
Okay. Okay. All right. Anyone else want to share anything in regard to this? Yeah, Joanne.
Insecurity.
Yeah. Okay.
Might be fear.
Fear, some of that. Yeah, that type of mindset. Yeah, Sasha.
I guess it's similar to laziness, but procrastination.
Yeah, yeah, okay. It's interesting. Laziness is actually a mental factor in Buddhism. This is where, again, some people might, if we really look at it, it's a mental state more than physical. Our physical bodies can have some effect on it, obviously, that we don't have the energy to do everything, but it is really a mental state. Yeah, Millie?
I was going to say, I self-sabotage myself.
Okay.
Even though I have goals that I know that I want to do, but then I find that there are distractions that I can easily go to, that I can generate to, but it's helping somebody.
Right.
When somebody comes to me with an issue, and then all of a sudden I'm finding I'm dealing with their issue versus mine.
Right.
So I see that as partially laziness and distraction. And it's easy to figure out somebody else's.
Yes, it is. That's one of the interesting things. We always have a tendency to be able to read what's going on with other people so much better than we have ourselves. Yeah.
Totally.
I remember one set of teachings back at Seichenling in San Francisco when I first started going there in the 90s. There was a teacher that came in teaching on a mind training text as well, and he said, as you go through this text, it's going to be very easy for you to look at other people and say, oh, that's what's going on with them. That's why they're having these problems or these difficulties or why they're in such a state. But he says these teachings are always about looking at ourselves, holding the mirror up there, not letting it reflect everyone else.
Because then it leads to gossiping and talking with other people, and the talk of, where you're having discussions where you really shouldn't be talking. Isn't that one of the things that we're not supposed to be doing, is talking about other people? And yet that's what is. Anyway, so.
Good. So I heard a lot of references to like fear or this sort of sense of insecurity, this mental state that is problematic. I mean, again, not to say that it's interesting. I was just talking about laziness being a state of mind in Buddhism, but when we look at the traditional way that all these various states of mind, mental factors and so on are set out, or components of mind, fear isn't even on the list. I find it quite interesting. Nonetheless, fear is used frequently in Buddhist teachings in terms of acknowledging wholesome fears versus unwholesome fears. And what we're talking about here, as I'm gaining from what people have shared, is we're talking about an unwholesome fear. A wholesome fear, for example, even we have this even in our conventional world, right? If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, you got elevated cholesterol and elevated this, and it looks like you're heading towards heart disease or whatever, well, that's a wholesome fear to hear and generate in your mind, because it causes you to change your behavior. Then you change what you're eating, or you exercise more, you do whatever, take the medication, whatever the response is, so that you can avoid that suffering in the future. Anything that's kind of directed towards helping you to avoid suffering and keeping you from, that type of problem in the future can actually be really wholesome to generate in the mind, and something that can be useful. Whereas a lot of what we have is kind of unwholesome fear, is fear that is just coming from our own, as I said, vulnerability, our own sense of insecurity, and reacting to things around us in ways that are quite detrimental. Yeah, Millie?
So something that just kind of came up was definitely the feeling of loss of control.
Okay.
So that it's the fear of, so there again it's the fear, but it's the loss of control, that I don't have control over a certain situation or control of what's going on, when in fact I thought I did everything all properly, and then that happens.
Right. Okay.
So loss of control.
Right. I think that can be definitely a part of this. So is there, when you talk about that situation, or even invite those who had this sense of fear and insecurity arise, what are the sorts of triggers for that? What are the things that you encounter? You were
Criticism.
Okay,
or
good.
Blame.
Good.
Criticism,
okay.
Blame.
Things we hear. Yeah.
So comments of you. Well, it's all.
Okay.
You did it.
Okay.
It's your fault. It's because of you.
Right. Okay. Anne, is it similar for you, or are there other things that trigger that?
Fear of criticism.
Yeah.
Certainly one of them. nothing else comes to mind right at the moment.
Okay. Joanne, you had some things around
Rejection.
rejection. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And Jake, did you want to share anything? What are the sorts of things that trigger your sense of insecurity? Or
I think that
if I'm getting too personal, you can say thank you very much. I'm just trying to get some examples to use, because when I go through the next step, it's going to be useful to have something that's concrete that we can say, this is why that's arising in terms of the stimulus. Yeah.
I actually relate to Familiy. I think that
Uh-huh.
my temper probably comes up through wanting to control my external circumstances,
Right.
and realizing that I think that sometimes in the meditation I can let that go, but I think that the root cause is probably same
Okay.
reason.
Okay, good. So this losing control, the criticism, the rejection, these types of things that come into our lives, and they produce, or are part of the production of that fear, insecurity, whatever. Okay, so we're going to work with that as an example. And I apologize for those of you who I'm not working with your example, but we'll hopefully have time to talk about some of these as well as we go through this weekend. So the next thing I want to share with you then are kind of the 6 factors that are set out in the traditional teachings, because I think they're all really useful to look at. A number of them really, really useful. The other one's still quite useful as well. To show why these delusions are arising so that we can identify the factors involved in their arisal. Sometimes this first step can almost be enough to even induce the second step of being able to counteract them, because if we get really clear about why they're arising and when they arise and the sorts of things that trigger them and all the various factors that play a role in them, we can begin to have more awareness at that time. Catching them at this point, when they're just simply arising, is the easiest in terms of effort, because it doesn't take much if we kind of get it right at that point where it's quite small, where we've only got that little moments of insecurity or fear. When it becomes much larger, it's more noticeable, but it's much harder to counteract at that point, because we've already fed the process. The wolf is already quite large and angry. So to try to get it back in the cage at that point is much more difficult. So we're going to spend a bit more time on this whole idea of identifying the negative states and the factors that give rise to it, because that's a very useful information and a useful context to have around the arisal of these negative states, these harmful habits. Okay? So we're going to use this one. The very first of the 6, these actually come from Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path. This is presented in the section, the middle scope, where he goes into the delusions as being the cause of our suffering, these negative states of mind, harmful habits. He says there are 6 factors that give rise to this, and I'm going to give them in a slightly different order than what Lama Tsongkhapa does. The very first one is what we were just looking at, this question of what is the main stimulus that gives rise to that. In the traditional teachings, this is simply called the object. The object of that negative state of mind is something that comes into our field of experience. Oftentimes it comes from outside of us. It's things we hear, criticism of ourselves, or things we're detecting, we're seeing, the out-of-controlness of the situation and our desire for it to all be in control and us to have it all managed, and we get freaked out by that. Or whatever it is that is happening, again, the things that you identified as being the stimulus for you to have that fear arising. And all of us have some level, I think, of insecurity or fear, so we can fill in the blank for ourselves. But what is the object? In psychology, they frequently call this the trigger. We're not denying in Buddhism that that object plays a role. In fact, we're embracing that as part of our reality, that these objects do come into our sphere of experience, and we have a particular pattern that follows. It's the sort of starting point for all of it, in a sense, in terms of the individual experience. So I want to talk a little bit more about one teaching that Pema Chodron has. She said she actually got this from one of her teachers. I think it's Sigar Köntrul Rinpoche, that she identifies as the source of these teachings, because I find it quite interesting. And I found something very similar in a book by Martine Batchelor, who comes from a Korean Buddhist tradition. She's the wife of Stephen Batchelor. And anyway, what when we talk about the object coming into our sphere of experience, it's not that the object is totally independent of the mind then. There is an initial reaction to the object that Dzigar Könto Rinpoche says is, he gives it this Tibetan word, Shen Pa. Martine Batcher calls it grasping. But what in essence happens is when that particular stimulus comes into our field of experience, we have this immediate reaction. And let me read a few words of what Martine Batchelor says about this when she calls it grasping. She says, grasping is a primordial pattern. We often feel that the world is sticky or that we are somehow adhesive. Things stick to us. Each time we come into contact with an object through our senses or thoughts, the pattern of grasping has an opportunity to manifest. So it's this idea that we're kind of like flypaper or something. I hate to use that analogy, but things adhere to us so easily. We like immediately have this impulse to get all caught up in them. And there's not really a whole lot of thought behind this. It's something that is, in my estimation, and looking at it from the teachings I've had, probably more karmically conditioned. Because some people may not have that trigger for them at all, right? Maybe we know people who hear criticism and it's like water off a duck's back. They don't really hear it in that way. They don't have that Shen Pa or that grasping that immediately reacts to it, immediately gets stuck in it. Actually, Pema Chodron has a whole series of teachings on audio that's called Getting Stuck. Or maybe she even called it Getting Unstuck. I can't remember what the title was. But, we get stuck and then we want to get unstuck. But getting unstuck is sometimes a little bit harder. But if we have an awareness that this is happening, that when you hear that criticism, when those words enter your ear and come into your field of experience, because it's not just the ears hearing them. If it was just sound coming into the ears, there wouldn't be a problem. But then our minds immediately get attached to it. We adhere to it. We immediately put that in the category of criticism that we don't want to hear. We don't consciously do that, I think. We don't sit there and go, oh, what is this? Should I listen to this or shouldn't I listen to this? But if we have some of that awareness, sure, we can do something different. We can make a change. We can put our hands together in the opposite way. But the initial kind of gut reaction is to have that Shen Pa. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Pema Chodron talks about this because it's similar, but it's slightly different. She calls this sort of getting stuck or hooked. And she says an alternate translation of Shen Pa, which I guess Shen Pa is traditionally translated as attachment or grasping. But she says an alternate translation of Shen Pa might be hooked. What it feels like to get hooked. What it feels like to be stuck. Everyone likes to hear teachings on getting unstuck because they address such a common source of pain. Here's how Shen Pa shows up in everyday experience. Somebody says a harsh word, and something in you tightens. Instantly you're hooked. That tightness quickly spirals into blaming the person or denigrating yourself. What was said gets to you, it triggers you. It might not bother someone else at all, but we're talking about what touches your sore place, that sore place of Shen Pa.
How do you spell Shen Pa?
Shenpa. Again, this is a what would be the word for it? It's the pronouncing in putting into English letters how the Tibetan is pronounced. The Tibetan's different letters, but so I don't even know what there's this system called Wiley that gives what the actual Tibetan letters are using English letters, but how it's pronounced is Shen Pa. Yeah. So and it's actually the book that she has this in, if you want to pursue it, and I think her teachings are really quite nice on it, is a book called Taking the Leap. But again, she did a whole audio tape series that I think is called Getting Unstuck. You don't want to get stuck, you want to get unstuck. But it's kind of, another way to look at this is it's sort of the charge that's behind it. It's got some charge for you. Those critical words that we hear, or that resentment or rejection or whatever it is that causes us to start going in that direction, it's got a charge for you. It gives, and again, we can't say that it's solely from the side of the object, but the object does play a role. Why? Because you are karmically conditioned to have that Shen Pa, to have that moment of stickiness that causes you then to get all involved in it, to just keep moving forward with that. I find it kind of interesting in Shantideva's text that I referred to last night a bit, chapter 6, which is of the Bodhisattva's way of life. Chapter 6 is on patience. And this is a verse actually that Geshe Dakpa taught on when he began his teachings on patience up at Seychenling a few weeks ago. And he, in this verse, Master Shantideva says that the sort of fuel for our mind of anger, which sometimes these sorts of thoughts can transmute into, where we get very fearful and insecure, and sometimes we then resort to anger as a way of responding to that. That the fuel of anger is mental unhappiness. So what happens is that object comes into our sphere of experience. It produces an unpleasant mental sensation, mental unhappiness, and we're immediately hooked. We're immediately get sucked into it. We don't have a whole lot of control over the getting hooked part, but we can get unhooked. Why? Because initially we're not going to have a lot of control over what triggers us. The things that are in our field of experience that push our buttons, that cause us to be reactant in that way. But we do have a choice in terms of we can learn to let that go, to get unstuck. This is, I think, again, an important thing to acknowledge right from the beginning, is that although we say that object is one of these 6 factors that contributes to it, first of all, it's not just any object, it's only those objects that we have a particular inclination towards, again, some karmic predisposition. And at that moment, when it comes into our experience and we immediately get latched onto it, there is some potential to let go of it right there. And as I said earlier, it actually takes a lot less effort to let go of it there than to let go of it when we've already been grasping onto it and make it into something that's so much bigger. This is another factor we're going to look at momentarily, that kind of the contributory forces that make it stronger and stronger and harder to overcome. Why these eventually become habits in us, because we keep thinking in the same ways. What is the old phrase that someone on the internet attributed this to Ben Franklin? I have no idea who came up with this phrase, that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We've all heard this, right? I don't know. Bless him, Ben Franklin, I don't know. Maybe I love this one website that's called Fake Buddha Quotes, where like they debunk all of these quotes that are out there, that they're attributed to the Buddha. Some man has like dedicated his life to like going through the sutras and trying to find all these quotes that people attribute to the Buddha. Of course, my favorite one that was an obvious fake Buddha quote was the Buddha saying, "Chill, homie, you gotta let that shit go." I don't think the Buddha said that. That's good advice for the weekend, right? Chill, homie, you gotta let that shit go. So where was I? This idea of doing the same thing over and over again. We can begin to see that this is a pattern that we buy into. And the moment of buying into it is that Shen Pa moment, that grasping moment, that moment that we're there. It's almost like, again, we don't have much choice in that until we're karmically conditioned to not react to those sorts of things, to be able to hear criticism like we're hearing, the blissful advice of our guru or something. It takes a lot of conditioning to get to that level. But initially, when we hear that criticism that makes us feel insecure, that causes that feeling to arise of fear and what have you, we have to see that there's something happening there that could actually be a release of that. Now, again, does it necessarily change the situation? Well, maybe not. But it changes how our mind is in the situation. Once more, we're in a much broader perspective then. We have different things we can use to react or respond to that, not react to it in the habitual ways, respond to it in much more constructive ways. So the object is the very first thing that plays a role in terms of these 6. We could really say it's contact with the object. It's that moment that we get kind of all caught up in the object, that all of that is happening very momentarily, very instantaneously. The second thing that is one of the big factors of these 6, and this is something I'm going to spend a bit of time on as well. Traditionally, this is called kind of the predisposition. Oh, I'm sorry, this isn't the one I'm going to spend a lot of time on. This is the third one. I jumped ahead here. The second one that I want to say is kind of the idea that, And this is where we're going to go probably later in the weekend when we start looking at the third of these difficulties, wanting to eliminate them completely, is we have to recognize that one of the factors that plays a role in the arisal of fear, in the arisal of attachment, in the arisal of anger, in the arisal of any of these negative states of mind, these harmful habits, is the predispositions or the seeds of them that have been planted in our minds that are there from our past having done them. Every time that you engage in one of these actions, this is another thing that explains our habits. Every time that you engage in a state of anger or fear or this kind of unwholesome fear, you are planting a seed for that mind to arise again. Yeah, I mean, it's one reason why we have to break these habits is because we're strengthening the habit by virtue of every time that we do that, we keep planting new and new seeds for that. So then you have the predisposition for that to arise again, meeting with an object that stimulates that to arise. So in the case of this fear or insecurity, every time that we plant that seed, we are just giving the potential for a future arisal of it. And this is with all of our delusions. We call these sort of, again, our afflictive obstructions, is the fact that we've got not just the manifest forms of these when we are in an active state of anger or fear or whatever, but we also have the latent form of them, the predispositions, the seeds of them to arise on the mind. And they will give rise to those when they meet with the proper stimulus, which again is contact with an object where we have that type of response, where we have the fearful response or the hateful response or whatever it might be, the attachment response, the desirous mind that comes into contact with pleasant things and immediately it's just grasping onto them, wanting not to be separated from them, wanting to recreate that experience again and again. So this is kind of a given that is going to be there for a while until you do the deeper work. Why? Because to get them completely eliminated, this third step that we'll get to towards the end of this course, we have to do much deeper work. But this is just an acknowledgement that predisposition or seed is always going to kind of have that potential to arise, but it won't necessarily arise and become manifest unless we feed the wolf, unless we do what is necessary for it to give rise to that full-fledged emotion, that full-fledged habit. So these first two, I kind of call these sort of like the foundation for why the whole process begins, is that we have the predisposition for it, the seed that we planted, and then we have contact with an object. And then, as I said, this sort of Shen Pas, or this ability for us to latch onto that object, and then everything else follows. Everything else are influencing factors that will play out in terms of the strength of that emotion, or potentially the weakness of that emotion if we don't go to those places. Let me see if there's questions on these two. These are the first two of these 6. I find.
So are you saying that those seeds, they are already in our alaya?
Yeah, and your mind, your sort of foundational mind or consciousness, yeah. Now, if you ask the question, well, what's the mechanism by which they're there, then that gets to be a pretty complex problem, to kind of explain. But mind, as I said, with this idea of what mind is, mind being its own phenomenon that has a lot of dimensions to it, goes back without any beginning. So everything that we have done has in some way planted seeds or predispositions on the mind that have shaped the experiences that we've had, some of which have been exhausted. Those sort of karmic potentials gave rise to particular emotions and what have you. And then they fell away, but they were always replaced by new ones. So we've sometimes used this term seeds, but we're not talking about anything physical. We're simply talking about this mental energy in a sense. I don't know how, I use the word energy frequently because I don't know what word to use other than, again, seeds, dispositions, latencies, I don't know. But it's all kind of being carried with the mind. This is why, when we get into these deeper teachings that are part of eliminating them, we start looking at self-identity, and that's at the root of all of this, is our clinging to a sense of self-identity that is not in line with reality. But even in spite of that, we still are the recipients of our past actions, in the sense that there is still an experiencer, that is the consciousness together with whatever that body is that they're embodied in, that is going to experience the fruits of past actions. This is an infallible truth that we all are living with. So our reason for wanting to address these things now in this lifetime, especially this human lifetime, where we've got a human intellect and an ability to look at these teachings and make some noticeable change in our lives, isn't simply for greater peace of mind in this life. I mean, nice if we can have that, right? If we can be a little more confident and not so disturbed by situations around us. But it's moreover to begin to do that work so that our future existence won't have as much work to do. It's kind of like, I like to compare these to like a relay race. I used to run the relay in high school. And when you give the baton to the next person, you want to be in good position, right? You want to get as far as you can during your leg of it so that they will be in a more comfortable place to be able to do their leg of it. So we're going to be passing the baton to our next life. It's not going to be you in the sense of who you are in this life. It's not like Don is now that person. There is a Don that is this person now, and then there will be somebody else who is that person there. But there's a continuity of awareness and a continuity of all this stuff we're bringing, all the stuff that we planted that is good, bad, and different. I mean, it's just the mental makeup that we've got, the force behind all of this that kind of moves us from life to life and causes us to have various experiences. So we should have that concern for our future selves and for, of course, the liberation from that whole process. Because that's the deeper work, again, that we'll look at, is how do we actually undermine this to the greatest degree so that we're no longer under the control of these factors. Anyway, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but did you have more on that, Christine, that you wanted to say? Okay. It's tough stuff to accept at some level. But it explains so much, and that's where, again, what I mentioned last night in terms of working with karma, because this is sort of a karmic component, if you will. These are sort of karmic seeds, karmic predispositions, because when we do things, we plant a seed that causes something similar to arise, something in a similar vein. So when we start looking at this, think about this as a hypothesis. Think about this as a working hypothesis. I'm going to try to live my life with that understanding, because I can't prove it to you. One of the teachings that only a Buddha really knows all the intricacies of how karma works, how all these predispositions work. But use it as a working hypothesis and begin to look at your life in that way. And what happens when you begin to pay attention to that? Is it something that has a positive effect on your life? Maybe the criticism doesn't go away, but you have a different mind when the criticism arises. You don't keep planting that same seed of insecurity and potentially then even distrust and hatred and whatever else might be arising. So we have to be, this is our job, to kind of tend to our minds in that way. Any other comments on these two, the first two? Yes, Ashu.
As you're talking, I'm kind of struggling. I mean, I get it, I guess, on an intellectual level, but what I'm struggling with is the whole concept of the seed. The seed has to be planted there. It's not just there, right?
Right.
And I think you mentioned something that it's in the foundation. So, I mean, I can rationalize it on my own, but what would you say to someone that's really struggling with the idea of how does that seed get there in the first place?
Yeah, this is a big question, because if we do hold this theory or this idea that mind goes back without any beginning, another part of that we would say is rational, is that we've had those seeds since beginningless time, meaning that there's always been a previous part of our existence that planted those seeds that give rise to them in that particular moment, and that give rise to them in the next moment, and so on. I mean, there's this, you can never find a beginning to all of that process too. I don't know if the Buddha ever gave an answer to that, because beginninglessness, by virtue of it being beginningless, means that there can never be any place that we look to and say, oh, this is where it started or came from. I think we have a tendency in the West to really like that idea. This is why, like, the Big Bang Theory made a lot of sense for folks, because there's a moment in time, that Big Bang, when it all started. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama, even in talking about the Big Bang, has said, well, no problem. Buddhism is fine with the Big Bang. It's just not the first Big Bang. There's always something. So there's one way of looking at that we just have to kind of stretch our minds to kind of think about this as an ongoing process. Now, there's one potential misunderstanding that we might have, though, on that basis. If we think, well, okay, my mind has been contaminated with these seeds and all this garbage since beginningless time, that therefore my mind's always going to be contaminated with that garbage. Well, the Buddha said that's not the correct thinking, because we can eliminate them. They're there, the word that's often used is adventitiously, meaning that until we address them, they're going to continue to be there. If you counteract them, though, they won't be there. Adventitiousness means it's just simply going to be present until you've done something to remove that. So the delusions are not in the nature of the mind at that level. The delusions are kind of like, I frequently use the example of a clear glass of water being like the mind, and the delusions are like the dirt that are in the water. So they cloud the mind and they cause it not to have that absolute clarity manifest, but the clarity of the water is still underneath all of that dirt, because if we run it through a very fine filter, all that stuff gets removed and we can see the clarity of the water again. So we're like the dirty glass of water going back since beginningless time, but we can be like the clear glass of water and remove all of that completely, because those pollutants are not in the nature of the mind. They're there just because we keep giving rise to the same causes for them to be there. So another thing in answer to your question, though, is I often use the example of if somebody came into your home and told you that the house was on fire, or your place of work, and they said, everything's burning around you, and you sat there and you said, well, I wonder where the fire came from. Did it come from one of the outlets, or did somebody leave a candle burning? Well, there's not much use to that in your predicament of being in a burning house, right? Discovering where the fire came from isn't quite as useful as getting out of the fire. So when we hear these teachings, it's one way of framing them that some people find useful, is that the Buddha's telling us, guess what? You're in a burning house. Guess what? This is your situation. You've been dealing with this since beginningless time. Your response, ideally, should be, well, okay, how do I get out of this? And that's what the Buddha's teachings are all about, rather than getting too caught up in, well, where did this situation come from? Now, what I'm giving you are the factors that do contribute and that the Buddha said are part of this process. But we have to understand that process has been going on without any beginning. So, unfortunately, we don't have an answer to that question from the Buddha. But I don't think there's as many questions that we don't have an answer to in this tradition versus some other traditions. I don't know. I mean, I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying that from my own experience. Growing up in a different religious tradition, I found I had many, many more questions that there weren't any answers for. And I think Buddhism explains things in ways that hopefully we can find some rationale. Again, a hypothesis that we can work with and say, this is how I want to structure how I see my life. And then I can make decisions on the basis of that and actually see more positive results. But it's up to us to do that. This is what the Buddha says. The Buddha said, don't believe what I'm saying simply because I'm the Buddha. Believe what I say because you see it to be truth. So, good. Thanks for your question, Ashu. Yeah. Let's go on to the third factor. I want to maybe touch on at least some of this. This is the one that I'm going to spend a bit more time on. This is what we call, again, there's different names for this, inappropriate attention or mistaken conceptualizations. So this is like that, okay, we've had contact with the object, that Shen Pas has happened, or that grasping, that initial kind of getting stuck in the object, whatever that criticism that we hear, to use this example that we've been working with, of the insecurity that arises on the basis of that. That has come into our field of experience, and we've got the seed for this type of feeling of, again, self-inadequacy, all of these sorts of things that are a part of that emotional response. That all gives rise to it. One of the greatest contributing factors is that we start cogitating and thinking about things in particular ways. These are one of the main things we want to break, is the thought patterns that are behind all of this. What I find one of the most interesting teachings that in terms of looking at our minds that the Buddha gave is that everything that we call an afflictive emotion is actually a thought process that happens really quickly. Again, we get that contact with the object and we immediately start going to the place of that insecurity. That is a storyline. That is something we're telling ourselves about ourselves. or the anger storyline that is telling us something about that person and how we're looking at them and so on. We have a whole thought process that we have developed into a really fine art, so that we don't even have to sit and go, how should I look at this person, or how should I hear that criticism? We have to start introducing different thoughts and undermine this inappropriate thinking or mistaken thinking. So I want to talk about a few things that are all involved in this. We'll continue to use this example. I like going to anger as well, because anger is such a common one in our culture, maybe even more common in our present culture, but there's a lot of it going around, and we see how harmful anger is. But when we have the mind of anger arising, okay, so in that case, we're coming into contact with something that produces that unhappiness, that unpleasant feeling. Some people get angry at a particular political figure. Some people get angry at traffic that's not going the way they want. Some people get angry at, food that isn't served warm enough or whatever. I mean, you have some sort of stimulus that comes into your experience. You immediately latch onto that through that Shen Pa. And Shen Pa isn't positive or negative necessarily. It's our thought processes that immediately follow, that think that this is unsatisfactory. This feeling of unhappiness I'm having, I want to be separated from it. I don't want to have to experience it. So we go through a whole storyline that is anger. That again, we don't define at that level of how should I think about this. I think I'll think about it as being something unpleasant that I want to be separated from. We just immediately react with anger right after that initial contact with the object. But it is a mistaken conceptualization. Why? Because it's not looking at things truthfully. And this requires a little bit more investigation. This is this teaching that I first encountered it at the level of detail that I really like. It's in a book by His Holiness the Dalai Lama at Harvard, when he kind of talks about why it is possible to counteract and eliminate these delusions, is because the negative states of mind are mistaken. They are not in accord with truth. And I like to point this out in terms of two levels. A stimulus. So there are two kind of levels that we can look at this and kind of see whether things are in accord with truth. First is just at what we call our conventional level. Is it kind of in accord with just the world as we observe it without getting into the deeper way that things exist? The second one is are they in accord with ultimate reality, with a deeper truth that we want to investigate? And that's going to be something, again, that we'll look at the end of this course in greater detail. But we can just stay at the conventional level and looking at these negative states and the way we're thinking about them and already begin to see that they're not in line with truth. So let's use this mind of, we can go back to the example of the criticism, and then we'll pull anger in as well. So when you hear criticism, and you have that feeling of insecurity or fear or whatever that is arising in response to that, how are you seeing that criticism? If you had to give definition to the thoughts about that criticism, what would you say that they are? Is that criticism something that is helpful? No? Yeah, Jake.
If I get criticism, I'm actually the kind of person that tends to be open to it.
Oh, okay, good.
Or at least tries to be.
Uh-huh.
I think that when I realize there might be truth to it is when I get angry.
That's interesting.
If I get angry, then I know there's probably some truth to my criticism that I'm getting. So,
okay.
I guess that's how I...
So what's interesting in your case, then, it's like the criticism is the initial object that you come into contact with, but then when you think about that criticism and recognize that it's something true, then you have a new object, which is the truth of that criticism.
Emotional reaction to the criticism that they're giving me. And if that happens, then I realize that there might be some truth to it.
Okay.
I'm usually fairly open to anyone giving me criticism or giving me feedback or anything like that, but it's when I start to get sort of emotionally charged that I realize, oh yeah, there's truth to this. There is something.
So if you had to put a label on that emotion that you're charged with at that time, what is that? I mean, is that also a sense of insecurity or fear, or is it anger? Is it?
Well, I think it's probably all of them.
Okay. So it is a negative emotion that's happening, but it's not something positive, definitely.
No.
Okay, good. Just to clarify. So it's a negative emotion that's arising, and it is a framing of that, even again, the feeling that you're having upon hearing that criticism, that you're assessing as, oh, there's some truth to this, so now I'm looking at my own kind of warts, my own negative side, and seeing what they're saying is actually something true about myself, and you're reacting in accord with seeing that. So when you see that, which is the truth of that criticism, or the feeling that's coming with that truth of that criticism, are you seeing the totality of who you are?
I think that, no, I'm not.
Okay.
Not the real person that I am. Not the true me.
Yeah.
I think that that's just the delusion.
Okay.
And like you said before, if I'm feeding certain delusions or certain, wolf or something like that, then that's the one that's going to be the strongest.
Right.
And for me, I can actually check it.
Sure.
And I'm actually trying to get better. I'm getting better. Being at checking it and being able to see, what's true and what's not. I think it's important also to separate yourself from what's yours and what's somebody else's.
True.
So criticism is funny that way.
Okay. So the one point I'm going to emphasize from what you've said is this idea that, again, you're not seeing the totality of who Jake is, that Jake also has many good qualities, that Jake also has many things that are positive, and what you are hearing and sensing in this, bringing this criticism into your field of experience, or even the feeling that arises together with that, and identifying then so strongly with something that somebody's pointing out to you that is unfavorable, that is something that needs to be addressed, isn't really seeing the totality of who you are. I mean, and because it induces a negative state of mind about yourself, and you're actually doing more harm to yourself at that time than good to yourself by following that state of mind. So what this is pointing out is that we are sort of constructing something that is not really in accord with reality, because it's, first of all, not seeing things that we're blind to at that point. And it'll be maybe a little bit more obvious even when we look at anger. But we're also then doing things that are not really in our best interest at that time, because we're kind of putting fuel on the fire rather than putting the fire out.
Sure, I think that the fire you're talking about, let's say, or the Shen Pa moment, I think that a lot of times, for me, what helps is realizing that the fire I might be feeling, it may not even be mine. It may be somebody else's.
Right.
And so, if I'm able to look at that and kind of distinguish the difference, I think then I'm able to get clarity on, what's mine and what's not, and actually be able to actually be open to criticism, because I'm actually truly trying to take a look at that.
Yeah. Good. I think that all sounds great. That's a good way to look at it and to be clear about. And again, when we define what is clearly ours and the stuff that is our process that we're feeding, the wolf that we're tending to, then to know how to address that, and again to be able to say, this is something I need to take ownership of and try to do things differently again. So I think this is great. This is a good example of that. Let's look at anger. Okay, so say you get angry at somebody honking at you from behind because you're not going fast enough or something, or you've done something that maybe is not the best thing to do, and so they're just wanting to let you know that they're annoyed at you, and you get annoyed at them equally, So you have that moment of the Shen Pa happening again. You hear the horn, you look in the rearview mirror and see their angry face or whatever, and you have those things that stimulate the arisal of your own anger, which you have seeds for in the past. When you see that person through the lens of anger, how are you seeing them and their actions? You're seeing them, I think, as sort of being this horrible, awful, evil person, right? You're not seeing them through the lens of all their good qualities again. You're not seeing them as, oh, here's a person behind me that probably has a lot of good things they do, taking care of the people in their lives in ways that are really quite nice, and maybe they even do volunteer work or whatever. Maybe their job is to do something really quite amazing. We don't see any of that side of that person. And I'm not saying that they necessarily have all of that, but we're only taking a little sliver, and a really tiny sliver, of their life, which is them honking a horn and getting angry and upset at us, and defining them by that moment. Is that in accord with truth then, would you say? No, because I always kind of turn the tables on this, and I say, would you want to be identified as being the person that you were at your worst, when you got upset at somebody, angry at somebody? We've all done it, I'm sure, right? Had our moments where we lost our cool, and we got upset at a stranger or somebody who did or said something to us, and we just, if they took a snapshot of that, and that's how they identify you for the rest of your life, you would be really upset, right? Be like, I'm not that. That's just a small part of who I am. That's just like when I lose my cool and I act in that way. It's not who I am. But we're doing that. We're taking a snapshot of that person in the rearview mirror, and that's who they are. That's why we get angry at them, because that's all that we can see at that time. There's no, again, back to that spiral. I love that spiral. We've gotten into that tight, narrow spiral that's negative, that's only seeing them through the lens of a very, very limited view. We don't have the broadness of being able to encompass them as being so much more than that. So it's His Holiness fundamentally saying that these delusions, these negative states of mind, harmful habits, every one of them is not grounded in truth, because we're not seeing the full picture, even at the conventional level. We are tuning in to that thing that causes that to arise, that part of that experience. That is, again, if we talk about the object in regard to the person honking at us, it's the honking and the angry face that causes us to react to it. It's not really the full person, but we throw the person in there with those actions, and we have a response that we think is totally justified, because they're this horrible, awful person that just happens to be honking at us and getting upset and angry at us. Particularly if we didn't do anything, right? Then we are even more justified in seeing them in that way. I didn't cut in front of them. I didn't do anything wrong. I did use my turn signal, whatever. All of our own justification for why they shouldn't be honking at us. So we feel like we're in the right and they're in the wrong, and they are absolutely in the wrong. But we don't know that person's story even. Why they're doing what they're doing. Maybe they just had a really horrible thing happen to them. Somebody close to them died, and they're just really upset, and they're on their way to the funeral home. Who knows? We don't know anyone else's story. But we make them into something kind of concrete and absolute at that moment when our delusions arise. This is inappropriate attention. This is looking at things through a very narrow lens. Lama Yeshe, there's a wonderful book called Wisdom Energy, and it's composed mutually by Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa. And I think the part that is on these 6 factors, I think it's the 4th chapter of that text, Lama Yeshe goes into the example of romantic love. When somebody falls in love with the other person, the initial sort of attachment mind that's together with that, there might be some positive things that are there, as well, some genuine concern for that person, but initially falling in love is mostly about attachment. We're looking at that person in terms of only seeing what is wonderful about them, right? Oh, the way they talk, and the way that they look at me, and the way that they, whatever. All the various things that we get kind of attached to, that we put them up on this pedestal. And we think that they are the sum total of just those positive, wonderful things. And what frequently happens in romantic relationships is that we start seeing the warts. We start seeing the things that are not so pleasant. We start seeing the way that they clear their throat, and the way that they, drive, or the way that, we can get annoyed at almost anything. When you start opening up to that those floodgates become open, and you go to the exact opposite then. They were up on a pedestal, and all of a sudden now you've forgotten about everything that was positive about them, and you've taken them down to this lower point where you want nothing to do with them. Well, which person are they? In truth, nobody's kind of one or the other. They're a combination of things. Most people have positive qualities and negative qualities. And again, what makes them positive or negative is our own response to them. Somebody may love the way that person looks, and we don't like the way that person looks. everything is our own sort of interpretation. So anyway, it's Lama Yeshe's example was using romantic love and the attachment that comes, the desire that is there when we fall into love and so on. And then when we fall out of love so quickly. So if we start investigating again this third element, we see that one of the most important things that is involved in this is this idea of not seeing things truthfully. Why? Because we have exaggerated or overestimated what's there. In a positive way, when we have things we're attached to or we have some pleasurable experience with, we highlight all of that that's wonderful and we over-exaggerate it and think that that's the sum total of it. In the negative side, we do the opposite in terms of we're looking at what is unfavorable and we exaggerate that or make that the focal point and forget everything else. This is one of the main mechanisms by which we cause the delusions to arise. Because we could say every one of our delusions is essentially, well, down to the level of maybe our ignorance. Ignorance is a bit more generic in that regard, but most of what we have in our delusions is arising on the basis of either a reaction to something that we find pleasant or a reaction to something we find unpleasant. The neutral stuff, we don't get so charged about. But, something that's pleasant can cause us to have pride to arise. Something that's pleasant can cause us to have attachment, greed. They say jealousy is more related to the anger side, the unpleasant thing. But even in regard to some things that we get envious of, it can be some sense of attachment to that pleasurable thing. Whereas the unpleasant ones cause our minds of anger, our minds of hatred and miserliness and all these kinds of things to arise. It's when we kind of have to encounter what is unpleasant. So we got these two sort of polar things that are happening, and our thought processes greatly shape how we look at those. You're going to continue to have pleasant and unpleasant experiences in your life. You're going to continue to have contact with objects that induce those two sensations. But what thought processes do you use to feed the arisal of the delusions, of these harmful habits? Christine, yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that when we see a person, behind us honking and all that, and we only catch that person at that precise moment,
right,
and get angry or whatever at that person, we don't know, that person may have other qualities as well.
Sure.
We only see him or her at the precise moment.
Right.
But what about when you know that person all your life,
right,
and that person has a habit of lying, and he or she keeps lying all the time.
Sure.
So it's not that just one precise moment,
Right.
but it's a recurring thing.
Sure. And I think
And in a way, it's like that's his character or her character,
right,
of lying.
right.
How
And
you, so
yeah, what do you do in that situation?
Yeah.
Or is that valid? One thing is we might question further, but do they lie to everyone? Are they completely dishonest, kind of in their very nature?
pretty much.
A natural-born liar, Because I think the Buddha would say we could even, and again, there might be other investigations that we could do on top of this that are some thought processes that we would introduce that would cause us to have a more positive emotion towards that person. There can be probably, again, some reasons why people become liars that we may not be aware of at that time. Maybe some people, again, grew up in households where they were constantly being questioned by parents who didn't trust them, and they had to lie in order to be pleasing their parents, in order to please others. And so we see that what's come to be a pattern of lying has come from a self-defense mechanism that was part of that factor in their lives. And it's not really, again, who they are. This is one thing that I was going to mention shortly as well, is that we have a tendency to identify the self with the emotion or with the behavior and think that they're one. Whereas really, when it comes down to it, these are simply, once more, things that are there adventitiously. This person is not a natural-born liar, meaning that they're inherently a liar and have lied from the beginningless time and are going to continue to lie forever. They are a person who's conditioned to lying and engages in that behavior because that is what they've strengthened. That's the wolf that they've fed. So we can actually begin to see them in a slightly different light too, as an object of compassion, because they're under the control of the wolf that they've inadvertently fed. They fed unknowingly. They don't have the tools that we're working with here to even know that this is something they should address. They feel quite comfortable in lying on Twitter or wherever.
But that doesn't mean that. No, I understand.
I don't know if that's who you were talking about. But
that doesn't mean we have to be near that person, right?
Sure, and I think that this is another thing is that we protect ourselves in terms of sometimes the first line of defense is don't have that object in your field of experience. And going back to that contact with the object being that where it all starts, well, sometimes we need to say, well, okay, then if this person's lying behavior upsets me and I can't be with them and I get really angry at them or upset at them, we'll try not seeing them, if we can divorce ourselves from them. But we can't do that forever, because we're going to eventually have people who do these things in our lives. We're going to see those, as I said, the pleasant and the unpleasant stuff still keeps happening. So we have to greater control over our minds, but sometimes the first line of defense is I'm going to pull away from that. And then we work on our minds to be better capable to be with them with different thoughts. As I said, we could have a thought of compassion for that person. Think about all the pain and agony they've caused to themselves and others through their lying. How unfortunate that is, because they don't have to lie. There's not again some person behind the curtain that's causing them to lie. It's their own mind that's caught up in these cycles of lying. So it's just having a different perspective that will allow us to have some space for that. And so once more, we're not seeing the full picture when we get angry or upset at somebody who engages in habitual behavior, because we're not seeing them through the lens of also understanding why they're doing that. We're not seeing them as a being who's like that clear glass of water that's simply polluted for the moment. They're polluted by their lying, but that is not the nature of who they really are at the deepest level. So I think we can still apply these teachings even when we see it. It's not just the random chance encounter with that angry person. Even when we have somebody who habitually does this, who is kind of always that way, but always is not always ever. I mean, Venerable Rabina, when she teaches, sometimes she says, we'll look at even Adolf Hitler, who people have a pretty negative view of in this world. I mean, he still loved his little doggy woggy, she says, he still loved his, he still had these positive emotions that we're kind of blind to, that the people that were in his direct circle, sure, he loved and cared for them in ways that we've not emphasized in history. History emphasizes the horrible, heinous things that he's done, or that he did, So he loved his little doggy woggy. Well, it's like 5 after 12. I'm sorry, I talked a little bit over, and we need to take our lunch break. So let's just, before we leave, and if you do have some additional questions on this, I'm going to continue talking about this, because as I said, even into this afternoon, I will be on this first point, and we'll begin to look at the counteracting of the delusions and the elimination of them. But this is the big one, this number 3, is this really, our thought processes do play such a key role. So we'll continue that investigation at 2 o'clock is when we resume. And this afternoon, it'll be from, I think, 2 to 5. We will have a break. Don't think that we're going to go straight through. I know we did that this morning, but we got about a 15-minute late start, so I didn't feel like I could really do that and manage that today. But let's just have a few thoughts before we leave here. Just because we don't know what's going to happen when we leave these doors, and we want to make sure that everything we've done is sort of safe and protected. All these positive seeds that we planted in our minds through these teachings that we're examining, these amazing words of the Buddha that we're looking at and trying to apply in our lives. Think very strongly that these are protected, that they will give rise to unbelievable transformation in our own hearts and minds, and in the hearts and minds of all beings. And just feel like we've absolutely made them safe and secure to be able to bring forth that result. Okay, so again, I think there's food. Yes? How is the... Oh. So do you want me to keep going? No, let's take a... Oh, are there any questions? Are there any questions on Facebook? No, okay. All right. let's take a break then. I think it's okay. We just get our full 2-hour break then, and if people need to use the restroom or get fresh air or whatever you need to do. So, okay. Thank you.